Good afternoon. I'm Emilie Shortk. I'm Chief Product Officer at Spirit AI, which is a company that is very heavily interested in natural language processing, and in particular understanding how people converse with each other, how dialogue flows, and then how we can apply that in a couple of commercial spaces that initially started out in the games industry, but we're actually looking at some additional applications. But our two products are Ally, which I'm not going to be talking about quite as much today, but is a product for watching for human-to-human toxicity in online spaces. So people are harassing each other, people are saying rude or racist things to each other, and the person who is monitoring that community wants to detect those interactions without having to read every single thing that's said in their community. Ally is a product that helps them detect and triage and recognize the most serious instances of those and the most serious abusers. So that's one area that we work in, and it's really quite relevant because there's a lot of data that we receive there that also becomes relevant to the second product that we're working on, which is what I'll be talking about a little bit more today, which is Character Engine. Character Engine is a tool for writing dialogue for characters in a game. There are some other applications as well that I'll come to in a moment. But it is taking some of the abilities that you might recognize from something like Dialogflow or Watson Assistant, chatbots, where you might be expecting to either speak to a system and use a speech-to-text understanding to be interpreted by the system that you're speaking to, or you might actually be typing into a browser. So both of those kinds of things are inputs that Character Engine is able to take and interpret. And we can also accept a wide range of other types of input as well. So the tool is really designed to allow you to take in and consider as part of the player's input, the user's input, all of those different forms of speech, so speech to text or typed speech, but also things that you might be getting from gesture recognition, from facial emotions, if you wanted to present the user with a finite set of choices, or let them let them do something in a game environment or even a physical environment and see that with computer vision. All of those things are inputs that Character Engine can receive. And then what you're doing as an author with this tool is you're saying, I'm going to write a series of narrative scenes for driving an interaction with the player, and the character is going to have certain things to say in response to different combinations of input, and we're going to determine which of those things they should say in reply depending on what scene are we currently in, what narrative scenario are we currently experiencing, what is the overall match of the salience between the things that we received as input from the user and what has been authored for this content. And then also there are some elements where we can actually say, all right, I recognize this particular type of input as being a question that ought to be answered from our knowledge model of structured data. So we're actually juxtaposing elements that are handwritten, more sort of personally scripted Q&A kind of searching elements with recognizing inputs that might be sort of more tightly defined questions, like questions you might ask in a murder investigation. Who was this suspect? Where was this person? And actually going to our structured data and coming up with an answer to it. So there are a range of reasons for doing this kind of structure and ways that we can apply this. Our goal, so the reason that I got into this in the first place, as was mentioned at the beginning, I come out of a completely different background from any of this. I have a PhD in classical studies. I wrote a doctorate dissertation on Hermes and Greek drama. So really very seriously unrelated to AI, except in the high-level sense that Hermes is the god of language. So, you know, here we are. That makes lots of sense, right? But what happened was that while I was in graduate school, I became really interested in the question of, I'm playing all of these amazing games, I'm having these really interesting experiences playing them, but none of these games are showing me interactions with characters that are as deep or nuanced as the kinds of things that we see pursued in literature. And I would really like to have interactions with characters in an interactive fiction or game environment where I felt that I was interacting with somebody that that had interiority, that had emotions, that had mentality, that could have memory over a long period of time of how I've treated them, and a set of goals about how to respond. So this is really kind of the originating goal of doing Character Engine in the first place, is to create a tool set that allows people to build this kind of experience and create a real sort of strong relationship between what the player has done to interact with this character and how the character is responding to them over time. So that brought us back into kind of the natural language space, partly because natural language is an amazingly expressive way of communicating with characters in games. You can communicate sort of factual information, you can ask questions, but you can also communicate emotionality, sentiment, and all of those kinds of things. I'm really interested in kind of exploring all of that space. So we built a couple of demos. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about in this talk is demonstrations that we built internally, rather than things that we've built as proof of concept for external clients, and that's because a lot of the material that we do for anybody else is understandably under an NDA. So this piece was a demo that we did early in our process, which was an interrogation of this robot who has seen some kind of murder event. And what the player is doing is really trying to ask questions to figure out what happened. So a lot of who was this person, what happened before that event, that kind of thing. And we actually built, so what you're seeing here is a screen for sort of a standard, it runs on your PC experience. We actually built a little VR version of this as well to play with, where your proximity to the character would also affect whether she currently was feeling more or less threatened by you, and that would affect also how she was choosing to respond to you. So a case of how do we combine together linguistic and other types of input in order to create the social domain in which she's choosing how to respond. So another completely different example that we built, this is not very graphically compelling, but there's a lot that we do with natural language output as well, generating text that's going to come out that's either going to be printed to the screen or is going to be spoken by the character using text-to-speech, possibly with some animated lip syncing. So there are all kinds of interesting things that you kind of set up for that. But this was an example that we did for a client who was actually interested in saying, all right, let's take this kind of application where we've got a character with some personality and some sort of interest in the world, and bring that into more of an enterprise space. So could you demonstrate to us what it would be like if we had a character that we could talk to that actually had a bunch of different kind of personality settings, and then depending on what you say to this character, they're going to answer your questions kind of in different emotional modes. So we've got this character who can be kind of more or less formal, more or less reserved, but is basically just there to help you pick out what movies you might want to see. And so as you're asking this character questions, that their text is being generated in response based on the structured data that they have in their underlying system. But as we ask them to say like, please be formal, please be informal, be more neutral, more opinionated, they're selecting both how they're going to express their answers using a generative grammar, and actually which elements of the structured data they're using to come back to you with, because this character is able to give you opinions on these movies, which is itself driven by the underlying structured data about which movies were well received, what genres they belong to, and so on. So you can actually interact with this character for quite a while and let it know what your genre preferences are. It will remember that kind of thing. It will make suggestions. And then if you leave this session and come back to it later, it will have remembered your profile, what movie you supposedly rented last time. It's all fictional, but it's kind of demonstrating that kind of interaction. So another piece that we did, much more back in the game space, it was a piece with a talking head with voice production and lip syncing.
One moment, you're in the
turn this down. Some people who have seen some of my previous talks may have run into this. So here we've got a scenario that is very much more like a conventional sort of 3D game. We're actually driving her voice and her face. Her face is showing emotions. It's changing up how it's lip syncing in response to things. And then on this side of the screen, we're actually seeing her dialogue being built out as we talk to her. And every time that we say something or type something to say to her, the system is running a series of natural language classifiers to say, is this a type of question that I recognize? Is that something I should be going to the structured data to respond to? Is it a question that has a response that's built into this narrative moment? Is it perhaps a social interaction of some sort that I should be responding to? Is it a greeting? Is it a threat? And also, is this interaction mentioning any things that are important parts of the story that have been designed as part of the sort of structured data about lore and backstory in this world. So if I run this for a moment longer, she says, who she thinks we are. We asked her how she knows that.
I've seen your profile, data, citizen.
And so you hear, like this is very imperfect. There are lots of flaws in this, but we're already getting, we've said something back to her that wasn't quite what she wanted to hear. We've challenged her a little bit. She responds with this kind of indrawn breath hiss. She's got a little bit more assertive response back, and that's a combination of her recognizing what kinds of elements were in that input and being able to identify the general type of, this is a question that's challenging you on what you just said. And then actually using some of the generative emotion elements of the system to be able to say, okay, well, in order to communicate how she's feeling in response to that, we're going to do all of this tagging and animation and selection of breath clip and all that kind of stuff. So if we go on for a little moment more.
Can you see what I am about to say?
She's driving the conversation again. She moves back into what she wants to get us to do. She's trying to get us to help her with the fact that this station's about to be invaded.
Readers will not usually volunteer who they are. I need to tell you.
So she'll respond to our input.
Have you heard of the Aeartan Empire?
Okay, and so this is a very tropey science fiction-y story that we've given this. There's this evil empire that's going to come and invade the station, and she wants your help. Very standard stuff. But she's doing a little bit of thinking about kind of how to structure what she's telling you. So she knows she needs, before she can talk to you about this empire is coming to invade us, she needs to give you a little bit of expository backstory about what the empire even is. And she's been keeping a running track of what facts and what entities in the game world have we talked about previously in this conversation. We haven't actually talked about the Empire or the Emperor before, so I need to introduce that before I ask you to do anything. But if as a player, I actually, maybe I've played this before, maybe I psychically guessed that there's an evil empire in this game, if I had mentioned that entity in my own playthrough before we got to that point, then she wouldn't have introduced this fact. She would have taken that dialogue in a different direction. So we're maintaining this kind of scratchboard of what has been said so far as a basis of how the dialogue should actually be flowing forward as well. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to make some generalizations about what we've discovered, about the design space that we've encountered, and how we're applying particular natural language techniques in order to accomplish different things, because we've actually found that there's kind of a range of different things that we want to do and that we can use in different circumstances. So as I said, I can talk about internal demos, I can talk about data from our demo users, and I'm going to go over some of the data sets that we have there in a moment, and I'm going to make some vague generalizations about client work. I can't actually talk about the specifics of the work that we've built for other companies under NDA, and also if you ask me about things that are patentable details of how our system works, I will also not answer those. Sorry in advance. Okay, so we saw this example, the robot interrogation demo. We took this to the GDC trade show, which is a big game developers conference, has lots and lots of people. Show floor runs from Wednesday to Friday, and we had people coming up and playing with and talking to this character at our booth all day long, every day on multiple laptops that were out there. So we collected a bunch of files from that, including nearly 10,000 different inputs that people use to speak to this character. We also have some log files previous to that we collected from beta testers both out at and outside Spirit. So we have both the kind of what was the data that was produced in talking to this character in context where people were repeatedly interacting with her and already knew something about the system, which were our beta testers, and then data about what happens when you expose this kind of gameplay to people in the general public. But it was still in a context where we actually had quite a lot of information about what the setting was, because in contrast to, if we had put this out on the internet, we would not have known or been able to control what hardware people were running it on, what sort of circumstances they were in, whether they were physically seated or standing, like none of that stuff. So we had all of this sort of second data set has the benefit of being kind of standardized in the sense that everybody who played it in that context was playing it on the same devices under the same physical circumstances. Things that we noticed about those data sets, and I'll kind of get into more about why this is important in a few moments, but what we noticed about the data sets is there's as you might expect, there's kind of a drop off in length of how long are utterances. So this is just a chart of how many sort of type sentences that have come into the system are 1 word long, how many are 2 words long, how many are 3 words long, and so on. And you see that like very quickly it drops off. Somebody typed in 13 words at some point, hoping to be understood, but probably not. But there's a strong spike at 1, and then there's another sort of hump at 4. And this reflects the fact that so much of the interaction with this particular character is being driven by questions that we're asking her, in fact, formally structured questions. Who is this person? What happened at this time? Where is this thing? And so because of that kind of question structure, it's very common for the most effective ways of interacting with her to have that kind of length profile. And people were really learning that, responding to it, and reusing it. What we see in the trade show data set is that there is a similar sort of overall shape, except that we don't get the spike at 1, which is a little bit interesting. There's actually like the sort of forward length of utterance was the most common thing for people to type. We had a certain amount of button mashing, which we just discarded. Somebody sort of mashed the keyboard to see what would happen. I discarded those as not really counting as one-word inputs. We did have a fair number of people typing in inputs that were pure punctuation. So question marks sometimes, exclamation marks sometimes, and in some cases ellipses. Actually, a surprising number of inputs were just ellipses. A couple of emoticons, but not much of that. We had some hi and hello, some yes and no utterances, and then a really strong preponderance of things that started with who, what, when, where, and how. They are forming questions in the structure that we've really encouraged. And also, interestingly, of those nearly 5,000 of those inputs explicitly did use a question mark. So people who are even in this fairly informal context, interacting with this game that they were typing into, were using enough punctuation input that we could actually use that as a helpful signal in determining is this a question or not. And in fact, we were not actually relying on that, but it's interesting that that signal did actually exist in the data. So things we find in distinction between the beta tester and general public transcripts, the beta testers swore at the robot a lot. A significant number of those one-word utterances were people being really rude to her. And I'm not actually going to put a load of examples up here because they're kind of upsetting. But I think one of the things that this correlates to is kind of people spending a long time with the same system get more kind of invested in pressing on the edges of it. We also had her set up so that if she was detecting things that she would understand as insults, and that was kind of as a type of social move, then she would become more upset and distressed. And so the beta testers actually kind of had an incentive to explore her distress arc, where we found that people who were just coming up to the system and using it for the first time were much more inclined to really try to win the game and try and solve the mystery and find out what was going on. And so they tended not to explore those emotionality edges as much, possibly because the structure of the game didn't really prompt them to do so. Another point is that the beta logs contain a lot more repetition of the same phrasing, the exact same phrasing, more than I would have expected. So this wasn't a case of beta testers simply learning, like, I have to type this general type of thing in order to be understood. Beta testers were often finding like one particular standard way that they wanted to refer to particular characters or ask particular questions, and they would just always use that same phrasing over and over again, even though a wider range of inputs meaning the same thing would in fact have been understood. So that's something to really bear in mind. I think we know, most of us who work in this space and work with testing of natural language experiences are aware that you really need to get these things tested by as wide a range of people as you possibly can, like a mass diversity of data. But I think that that issue is even stronger than I think people realize, because even with an individual, you're not even seeing the full range of ways that that individual might ask that question. They tend to fall into one particular bucket very quickly. The non-beta users, as I already said, did more keyboard mashing. Non-beta users turned out to be worse typists. Maybe that's just because they were standing up in a trade show and it was an awkward environment. And of course, they don't necessarily know or heed the limits of the system, so sometimes they'll say things or ask questions. We had a few people who would enter those sort of really long utterances that we saw, the sort of long tail of the data. Often those were things where somebody had actually typed multiple sentences into the system in order to kind of put forward their own view about what was going on. We also saw, as we were analyzing this, some interesting kind of control actions that people were using that kind of emerged from how they were interacting with this gameplay. So a certain amount of complaints about understanding, you misunderstood me, that wasn't what I meant, that kind of thing, which you will run into in a lot of kind of natural language interaction contexts. But also some complaints that were more specific to this particular story. So complaints about the robot not being forthcoming, you're not answering my questions, things that are sort of actions that belong to an interrogation. We're trying to rattle somebody or get at them. But it was an interesting case because some of these things would arise in response to situations where actually the system hadn't understood them correctly, but the player was interpreting an incorrect response as an evasion. So there's a certain amount of interesting kind of like, if we were trying to train a model based on how did players interpret what came back, it would be interesting in that the player perception does not actually always align with how accurately the system has read an intent to start with. Another thing that was quite common, I mentioned the frequency with which ellipses appeared. We see, in addition to those in the data, a lot of instances of people saying go on, or just a single noun or noun phrase and a question mark. And this was kind of a way of like, please go on with what you're saying. It was a way of handing conversational responsibility back to the character in that context. And then a certain number of challenges to statements. That can't be right. How do you know? Like, what are you thinking? Those kinds of things. And again, like, this is something that doesn't arise as much in kind of conversation data sets where you're looking at either sort of virtual assistants or customer service, because there's a kind of different social context. So one of the really interesting things that we keep coming back to with game applications of natural language is finding that the range of intents that are most common is very, very dependent on what the narrative content of the game is and the role that the player thinks they're trying to play. So we had anticipated that to some degree, and we had done some things like training specific classifiers that were designed to look for this player is accusing the robot of something, this player is accusing somebody else of something. Like, we knew we wanted to recognize those things, but there were a lot of sort of other subtler things about just how the conversation flow was controlled that was interesting to see in the data. Okay, so then we also, another sort of data set that we have available, we also took the commander to the same show the year later. We have a smaller overall body of data from this because we were showing this demo alongside a second demo that used menu-based inputs. So we're trying to show off like, hey, we can do natural language, you can also do menu inputs, and so people were kind of dividing their attention. So we only have about 3,000 inputs from this, but I actually have more sort of session information about this because we'd improved how we were logging this. So we were able to tell, with the interrogation demo, it was hard for us to tell if somebody had started talking to the robot and walked away, and another person had come to start talking to her. And so we had some better session data on this one. So there were 224 distinct sessions, about 3,000 inputs, of which a much higher percentage of these are yes/no inputs. Median session is 3.25 minutes. Actually, that's quite a lot of people finishing this because this interaction is not very long. So she can get through to several different endings, like either she successfully gets your help or she sort of sends you off in some other direction over the course of play. But there are several different endings that are all accessible within about 4 to 5 minutes of play. So those are those kind of pieces that we're looking at when I go through what information we have from these systems. And then also, as I said, some of the sort of client work that I can only just broadly describe. There was an educational project that we did, which was actually about creating kind of a language learning situation. We wanted to create a space in which somebody could come in to a pseudo restaurant and try to order a restaurant meal in the language that they were trying to learn. It's a very common sort of like skit that you might have in a language learning context in general. But it had the merit that the kind of social structure of like what happens when you're ordering a meal is pretty well known to people. So that provided a lot of context around how that interaction was going to play out. We had another project that allows for emoji inputs, and this is probably the one that I'm most sorry I can't like show you actual screenshots and examples from because it's super fun. But it allows for a kind of texting environment where you're texting with the characters that you're talking to, and you have an emoji keyboard. And the emoji keyboard it's not sort of all of the emoji that you might ever find on a device, but it is pretty extensive and allows for quite a lot of different, quite a range of different options that you might want to use, from sort of facial expressions and things that we might conventionally use to communicate emotion in conversations with other people to representations of objects that actually come into play in the game world. So there are kind of ways of referring to things that you're seeing in the game space via emoji rather than pure text. We have done actually more than one project, some of them sort of small, but more than one that are working with spoken input, with speech to text. I miswrote that one. The movie box chatbot character that you saw earlier, and then an in-progress character that is actually speaking about Spirit's own work. So it's basically meant to be something that we might put on a website, and you can come in and ask it questions about Character Engine, and it will say, hey, let me show you what it's like to talk to a Character Engine character, such as myself, and so on. So that's what we're kind of drawing on to look at some of the conclusions here. I also wanted to give you a moment to see a little bit more about the kind of the tool that actually sets this up. I talked about this at the beginning, about the fact that we're allowing people to create kind of narrative scene structures, but specifically around like what it's like to author for this, because if you're using this in a natural language space, you have set up kind of a range of classifiers that you want to be applying to the input, and then anytime that you as an author write down, okay, here's an example line by a player that I might want to match something similar to this, the system then runs all of the same classifiers that it would run at runtime, and all of the same entity recognitions, basically anything that you've got set up in its natural language tool collection. It will run all of that at tool time, and it will come back and say, like, hey, okay, this is what I recognized about your input. Does that seem right to you? And as an author, you could say, well, actually, like, you've recognized this as a question about, like, how I feel about chocolate, but actually I want the same response to apply, like, regardless of what entity I mentioned. So I might then actually delete the line input entity chocolate. But this allows people who don't necessarily know the classifier set particularly well, don't know when it's going to be applied, and so on, to make use of this kind of intent creation as well. There are also some ways of retraining those elements, but that's a little long-winded. But for instance, you get sort of your list of what are the classifiers that are active in this particular project, and that can be everything from some of the specific types of question that I mentioned earlier in the interrogation example. So event questions are things like when did that happen, but then also things that are much more social, like insulting language. We have from Ally a large body of example insulting defaulting language to draw on, which is not always delightful, but useful in this context. And then some things that we actually created in response to seeing the conversation flow elements from the robot demo, where things like the continue classifier are for recognizing the player just said something that indicates that they want to continue on the current line of dialogue. So we should try to do that to the extent that that's possible. So to kind of recap, sort of the general types of things that we're doing and applying in the natural language space. We've got some intent recognition of types of commands to the system. We can use our own classifiers, the kind that I just described and showed there. The system is also able to plug into things like Watson Assistant. So if somebody has an externally trained group of intents that they want to match against, we can do that as well. Some further work where we're actually like coming up with an actual parsing of the sentence so that we can do things like say, we only want to match this line if the subject of the sentence is this person. And that allows for really interesting kind of overlapping defaults, right? So you can say things like, if the character says something and we recognize the subject is this particular entity, but we actually don't really understand with high confidence the rest of what they're saying, we might default back to something like, oh, I don't want to talk about that person right now. So there are sort of different ways that we can strategize about how to understand what's been input and how to catch it in a way that's going to seem on character and direct the player back into the gameplay space rather than kind of letting them go out of domain. Some sentiment analysis. We do actually use some sentiment analysis, but in very specific ways. What we heard before my talk is correct, that a lot of sentiment analysis is applied in context of, here are a bunch of online reviews. I want to do some sentiment analysis on this body of online reviews and determine whether people seem to be liking my product or not. And those data sets don't tend to be particularly useful to us. But what we have found that we can do is sort of tweak some of the sentiment analysis data sets that are out there to be more specific to the domain of the particular game that we're doing, and then actually apply that in restricted context. And I'll come back to that point in a moment, but it can actually be useful. Another thing that we can look at is, like, does the player seem to be excited or bored? Are they using lots of exclamation points? Are they giving other hints into the system? If we're using audio input, sometimes volume and other features like that, speed can be relevant, although we haven't gone too deep into that direction. Are we detecting user frustration? Do they seem to be asking the same things over and over? Are they saying things that express that they're annoyed? And then doing some work on more sophisticated cross-turn co-reference resolution and other ways of determining, like, we've got this whole background of what you've just said to the system, as well as knowledge of what social situation we're currently in, and we can actually use that to refine our guess of which of several things you probably meant. So applying those different techniques alongside a lot of design techniques that have evolved for the game space. So as I talk, I have some slides at the very end of this that show some of the games that I'm talking about here, but there are a range of games that are kind of exploring this space currently. Some of them are AR or VR games where you're putting the player in a space where they can give commands or they can talk to other characters in a space, and so it's voice driven. There are also some games that are Facebook Messenger driven, where we're talking to people in a kind of chatbot context, and there are games that are designed for smart speakers like Alexa, where you're actually talking your way through what you want to do. And so from that kind of body of game design wisdom, we're seeing kind of initial guidance about how do we even write content for this that is going to intersect well with the capabilities of NLU currently in order to produce a good experience for the player. So obviously one sort of well-known and frequently used technique is to use the context of the interaction to really constrain what the player ought to be saying and what they should expect to be understood. So if we're in a high pressure situation, there's a bomb under the table, the NPC has the non-player character has a really excellent reason to say, hey, you know what, don't ask me about my favorite flavor of ice cream right now, we're talking about the bomb. Mysteries encourage targeted exploration. So we found that people did with the robot interrogation, they did ask some sort of sidelong questions, and I'll come back to some examples in a moment, but because there was a really sort of clearly defined, like you're trying to solve this, these are the people that might have done it, that encouraged the player to dig deeply into a particular expression space and mostly avoid other expression spaces if they were trying to win. So NPC moods and motives justify refusing to go off topics. The characters often are motivated to work with you, so they have a reason to hint to you. And this is kind of an interesting contrast actually with dialogue writing for a lot of other types of games. Like conventionally, a very common thing that you want to do when writing a dialogue tree for a standard console game, for instance, is have the NPC be a little bit, a little bit high friction, maybe a little bit snarky, maybe they're funny or insulting, or they are just opposed to you in some fashion. That's a very common sort of pattern, and it doesn't work as well in natural language conversations. It's often much more effective to have a collaborative conversation partner in that space, because it makes it easier to prevent the player from kind of going completely off-road, and it also helps with the moments when the player is experiencing some frustration. So if you are having a hard time communicating what you intend, and you're up against another character that is really responding to you in an insulting and negative way, that tends to break down the kind of empathetic connection that encourages people to really try and make the most of a natural language interaction with a character. And finally, as we said with the restaurant demo, familiar social contexts provide a really useful framework as well. So even if we've got some thriller scenario, some kind of high stakes drama moment, if we also place that in a context like I'm ordering a meal, I'm going to a dance, I'm catching a bus, like that gives a framework of interactions that the player understands. They know what to expect from it, they know what the sequence and the staging is, and if the player or the non-player character goes back to advancing sort of that social context, that's also expected and understood behavior. So there were a few things where even with that kind of constraint in the robot demo, we saw some interesting kinds of outcomes. Oops, I went too far back there. People said things like, what shape is the dent in your cranial unit? She mentioned that she had been hit on the head and lost some data. So some of this was like people getting even more specific about the evidence that they wanted to know about than we had really anticipated. Like she doesn't, I don't think, use the word shape at any point in her output. So we hadn't really anticipated that people would ask this, but there are sort of things about that. And then things where they start to get sort of more emotive or philosophical. What song was in your head when you delivered the blow? They're accusing her of having been crazy and also the murderess. Asking if another character treated her like a daughter. And this is something where, that's not something that the system could really create an answer from its knowledge model. Some role-playing where they're accusing her of betrayal, and then something really meta where they're saying, hey, this reminds me of iRobot, basically, so beware. Other strategies, I'm running out of time, so what I'm going to do is speak quickly to the points that most sort of contextualize the natural language elements. Communicating about what inputs you expect is also really important and valuable. There's a lot, if you're interested in kind of that aspect of things, there's a lot said and written about design for Alexa especially. Games for Alexa tend to really have explored how to do this. And also transitioning gently out of moments when you are guiding the player. So if you're giving kind of clues about, you might want to say this, you might want to say that. If you have been guiding the player heavily and then you suddenly stop, they will also tend to stop playing the game. So the most common place that people stopped playing this particular demo was when she stopped asking yes/no questions and they didn't really know how to deal with that. So you want ways of kind of guiding the player forward without blocking them, and I'm going to dive over some of these, which are fun. Sorry. And get to this one, because this is what explains what we do with sentiment analysis. So another really good strategy in this space is asking questions that allow for lots of different inputs of the same type. And this is something where, because you're both telling the player what kind of thing you want to hear, you're placing a nice tight constraint around it, but then you're giving yourself room to really deeply provide for answers to all of the inputs of that type. You can give the player a really satisfying experience. So there's a game, a VR game called Starship Commander that asks the player their age and has custom responses for everything the player might say from 5 to 95. There's like some joke if you say you're 43. There is a specific joke for that. The BBC project, that is a smart speaker project, asks for a favorite color, and again, you can pretty thoroughly cover the range of favorite colors. An unfinished demo that we're working on has an actor character that asks the user for a genre that they like and then delivers a sample line of dialogue from a movie of that genre. But then this gets into what we were actually doing with the custom sentiment analysis. We found applying sentiment analysis, especially when we didn't have high confidence in, it tends to be giving us sort of fuzzy information. That was something that we didn't want to use the results of all the time. We didn't want the character to be constantly interrupting and saying, you sound sad, or it seems like you're angry, because sometimes they'd get it wrong, and because that's kind of not really, like, unless somebody's really being very emotive, we tend not to interrupt our conversation flow with that kind of thing. However, if you flip it around and have the character say something like, how are you feeling right now? And then interpret anything that you say back as emotive, possibly in a metaphorical way, that gets way more interesting. So this is something where we had tuned our sentiment analysis data a little bit to go with a particular kind of context and situation, and then ask the character how they're feeling, and then it almost always feels good how the other character responds, and even if the player is actually trying to change the subject and say something that's not an answer to that, the fact that their input has kind of been construed as an answer still feels kind of right and kind of interesting. So that was kind of a cool space to use that. And then our tool also provides some support for some of these kinds of things by helping explore, like, what is the space of inputs that somebody might use when responding in this way. So I'm going to draw a line there and take questions, and then I'm also happy to share the remaining slides with people if folks are curious later. But
we have about 5 minutes for questions.